later on. And I will formally start our event by introducing you to these two fantastic authors we are hosting for a conversation. Warwick's is pleased to host Madeline Martin as she discusses her new book, The Librarian Spy, a novel of World War II, in conversation with Eliza Knight. Madeline Martin is the New York Times and international best-selling author of historical fiction and historical romance. She lives in sunny Florida with her two daughters, known collectively as the Minions, one incredibly spoiled cat, aren't they all, and a man so wonderful he's been dubbed Mr. Awesome. She is a diehard history lover who will happily lose herself in research any day. When she's not writing, researching, or momming, you can find her spending time with the family at Disney or sneaking a couple of spoonfuls of Nutella while laughing over cat videos, the best videos. Besides this event, of course. She also loves research and travel, attributing her fascination with history to having spent most of her childhood as an army brat in Germany. You'll hear about her new book, The Librarian Spy, a book that Karen Robards, author of The Black Swan of Paris, calls a stunning tour de force of historical fiction. She will be joined in conversation with Eliza Knight. Eliza Knight is the award-winning and USA Today best-selling author of The Mayfair Bookshop, a novel of Nancy Mitford and The Pursuit of Happiness, also available through Warwick's. I'll drop that link to purchase the book into the comments here on Facebook, as well as Madeline's. Eliza's love of history began as a young girl when she traipsed the halls of Versailles. Jealous. She is a member of the Historical Novel Society and Novelists, Inc., and the creator of the popular historical blog, History Undressed. She lives in Maryland with her husband, 3 daughters, 2 dogs, and a turtle. Before I leave the screen, for those watching live, please do remember to use the Facebook comments to submit questions. And after the conversation, I'll come back onto the screen and convey those questions. So without further ado, Warwick's welcomes Madeline Martin in conversation with Eliza Knight.
Yay, thank you so much. And thank you guys, everyone, so much for tuning in and watching us. We really appreciate it.
Yes, for sure. It's so exciting that we get to be here today and that I get to celebrate with you this exciting release. So, yeah, you're welcome. Why don't you tell everybody about the Librarian Spy?
Thank you. So the Librarian Spy actually was inspired by the librarian spies who were enlisted by the military, the American military, and sent over to neutral countries to gather intel in the form of pamphlets, underground newspapers, books, etc., and then sent back to America to try and gather intel on the enemy. So that's where half the book takes place, and the other half of the book takes place in France, where my heroine is based off of a woman who existed during the World War II with the French resistance operating the printing press for those clandestine newspapers. And the two connect via a coded message. Dun, dun, dun.
So you know, and perhaps some readers listening know, that I'm a total sucker for fiction that's inspired by true events, and even more so when it's inspired by real people. So the 2 heroines in your book were inspired by real life heroines from World War II. Can you tell us about them?
Yes. Well, so the American librarian, she actually is inspired more off of the idea of the American librarians. There was only one American librarian that I know of that was sent over with the IDC, and she actually went to Sweden, but she was like a consummate spy. And I really wanted, you know, when these spies were sent over to gather intel in neutral countries, they really didn't have any training. So, and I liked that idea, because I liked the idea that she had no idea what she was going. She was transplanted from this place she knew everything to a place where she knew nothing and was a total fish out of water. And then Ian Fleming's 007, the Casino Royale series of that, was actually inspired by his time in Lisbon. So from that, you can see how everybody else's spies were very, very well trained, and the poor American spies were kind of tossed in the mix. And so, so Ava Harper's character is based off of what they went through, but she is a fictional character. And then Elaine Rousseau in France is actually inspired by a woman who, so with Lyon, it was the capital of the printing in France and during the Renaissance. So there was no shortage of people who were willing to write articles, but a lot of people didn't actually know how to do typography, engraving for the pictures, and operating the printing presses. And those were usually jobs that men held. So having Elaine be able to go in here and do this, it was a very uncommon role for a woman. And so I thought that was such a fascinating way to incorporate that role into the story, especially with Ava in Portugal reading through those clandestine newspapers. And oftentimes those underground newspapers would have coded messages that would be sent off somewhere else.
That's so awesome. And by the way, guys, it's really a great book. You've got to get it. And we're going to try not to give any spoilers away tonight. At least if I ask you a question that's sort of spoilerish, just say, I'm not going to say anything.
Book.
Yeah, exactly. So like you said, Ava's kind of thrown into her position. She wasn't really given much training. How did she know what she was supposed to do? Like, I feel like if someone said to me, hey, go to this country that you've never been to before that probably doesn't speak the language that you speak and be a spy, I would literally just like run away.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it was pretty tough for her. They definitely did manipulate her her affection for her brother and really just also her love of her country to try to make the war end a lot faster by her contribution toward the war effort. But she also, you know, and that's really one of the biggest things that she struggles with is like with librarians. And I actually did interview a lot of librarians to make sure that I was making a correct character and that I wasn't venturing into cliche land when it came to writing a librarian.
Yeah.
And so, you know, one thing that I really understand about librarians is that they love to know everything, not like a know-it-all, just for themselves, that personal knowledge. And so, you know, with Ava, she's at the Library of Congress and she is very comfortable in her position. She's learned so much about it. She feels very knowledgeable about where she's at. And she's being asked to go to a place where she actually doesn't even speak the language. And so really she has about 2 weeks to kind of glean as much knowledge as she possibly can before being sent over there. And for somebody who craves information, sadly, that's just not enough. And so it definitely creates something of an obstacle for her when she gets over there. And she does, you know, go to the embassy and everything and kind of gets a nudge, but she is pretty much on her own for the most part.
Totally fish out of water.
Yes.
So it's really interesting how women were often asked to do clandestine things in like pretty much every country because people didn't really believe that a woman would be like, I don't know, conspicuous or something for that sort of job, I guess. Like, you know, in my book, The Mayfair Bookshop, Nancy did some spying on the Free French soldiers too. But they really expected the same thing from Ava. And Elaine was also kind of considered to be inconspicuous in her own right, in her village. So as she was delivering papers. But can you talk a little bit about women's roles during World War II and the way people sort of just interpreted that women would not be seen doing these jobs, and so they were like a great choice?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think that really, especially with the Germans, with the Nazis back then, their whole idea of women was that they really were supposed to just stay home and have children and take care of the home, and the men were supposed to go out and fight these grand battles and you know, bring home the spoils of war. And so they really did not suspect women of being capable even of espionage. They actually like really didn't even give them, they didn't even think that their mental capacity was capable of handling espionage. And so it really did make women such a great candidate for these roles of subterfuge. So you also, especially in France, for example, you know, you have these women who really played up that role because they used it to their advantage, where they would just, you know, titter, I guess, and giggle and just kind of play off the role of, oh, I'm just this girl that just likes fashion, ha ha. And, you know, one of the interesting things too is women always were walking around with these shopping baskets. And sadly, the reason why is because there just was so little food to be had in France during World War II. And so, so women had to constantly walk around with these baskets just in the hopes that if there was a random store that they came across that happened to get a random shipment at some point, they could get in line and get food right then and there, as much as their basket could carry or that they could purchase. So these baskets were, they were pretty ubiquitous. Everybody had them walking around, so it wasn't uncommon. And so a lot of the women with the French Resistance would have these false bottoms where they could transport notes, sometimes explosives, other sort of things in there. And it made it very easy for being able to transport. And men never really thought to look through it, because why would a man look through a woman's shopping basket?
Yeah. But you'd think at some point they would have picked up on that. Like,
I know. Yeah. Thank God they didn't.
they didn't want to think about it. They didn't want to think about the fact that women might have some sort of power or
Right.
at least some sort of independence to try to thwart them. They just didn't like that idea. And they were like, nope, not going to think about it.
Nope, they're too pretty. I have to also say too, like with the Mayfair bookshop, I think one of the things that was so fascinating about Nancy is, for those of you who haven't read the Mayfair bookshop, it's about Nancy Mitford. And when you think of Nancy Mitford, you don't think spy. You don't
No.
think somebody who's doing, grunt work for the war effort, but she absolutely did. If you want to chat a little bit about that.
Sure. So I think Nancy got into it at first because, sadly for her, two of her sisters were Nazi sympathizers. In fact, one was the rumored a lover of Hitler, and the other was married to the leader of the British Union of Fascists in England, and in fact visited Hitler quite often during the war. He was a guest at their secret wedding. And the government got a hold of this information and they contacted Nancy and they were like, hey, what's up with your sisters? We need you to give us information. And she really struggled with whether or not she should inform on her sisters, which I think would be something any one of us might really struggle with, no matter what. Like, yes, my sisters are horrible and they love Hitler, but at the same time, like, they're my sisters. Do I want them to go before a firing squad? There's like a question or a meme that, goes around the internet. Like, if your husband killed somebody, would you like tell someone, or would you hold it against him? Like when he goes, oh, I need this from the store. And you'd be like, well, you better go get it. Uh-oh. Anyways, it's a joke about basically like, would you say that, or would you hold it against him and be like, well, I guess you're going to do all the grocery shopping unless I need to make a phone call. But in any case, she sort of got into it that way. And then because she was so fluent in French and friends with a lot of French people, she happened to be asked if she would mind infiltrating the Free French clubs to sort of ferret out any of the Vichy French in London that were sort of hiding under the guise of being there as a free French person. And so she started listening in on those conversations and figuring out who was supposed to be there and wasn't. So I think she sort of fell into it because her family was so horrible, if that makes sense, sadly.
It is sad.
Yeah, and because she was such a like fascinating socialite and the French really loved her and she had multiple French lovers, she was really trusted in the French clubs, and that allowed her to listen in on a bunch of conversations that she shouldn't have. So that's how she fell into it.
I think that's fascinating, especially just like I said, when you think Nancy Mitford and you think this socialite, like the last thing you think of is like espionage and
no, and I was totally shocked when I learned about that. I was like not expecting it at all.
Yeah.
So back to the Librarian Spy. Prior to the war, Elaine struggled a lot with her like a role that she wanted to have and the role society expected her to have, but she was married to someone who actually believed that her skill was valued, right? So how did World War II allow her to sort of buck society rules as well as other women, especially when things started to get rough and her spouse told her she wasn't allowed?
So, I mean, that was very difficult. So in France, they, as you sort of touched on with Vichy, so when you had Vichy France, it was really this idea of what France should be under the Nazi occupation. So of course, women were expected to, play this role as a mother and how many children you can have. In fact, at the beginning of the war, when everything happened, Pétain, who was in charge of the whole Vichy France, actually put the blame of France falling on women, saying that the French women had not had enough male French children to properly protect the country. So that kind of really set the tone, I think, for what the expectation for women were in this role. And interestingly enough, I feel like there was really very much a juxtaposition. Like Like it was said that they, like Vichy was saying that, oh, French women were way too vain. They didn't want to have too many children. But at the same time, they wanted their women to be incredibly beautiful. At the same time, they were castigating them for their vanity. And so it was these women actually already, just even if you operated within the rules of Vichy France, were walking a very fine line of what exactly is even expected of them. But then you had these women with the French resistance, and they really did have very serious roles. Even if you consider a courier, which is what a lot of women were, which was transporting notes. Sometimes it would be taking information, or rather taking explosives that would go from the maquis, who were sort of like the wild soldiers that were living in the woods on the outskirts of towns. They would bring in the explosives that were dropped off by the British airdrops that were coming in. They really had very important roles, and their roles were incredibly, incredibly dangerous. And, you know, when it did unfortunately come to interrogation and torture, the Nazis did not spare anything when it came to women. And so, you know, their role was incredibly dangerous, but I would imagine that it also was incredibly empowering for these women to be able to take some of that power into their own hands and not just sit idly by and watch all of the men be taken off into labor camps, and everybody else really just subjected to the mercy of, or the lack thereof, of the Nazis.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. I can't imagine that sort of struggle either, being told to be one thing and then being told to be something completely opposite at the same time. That's crazy.
It's so dumb, but you know, sadly, I think that's been women's lot in life for a very, very long time. You know, like nobody wants a boring wife, but they couldn't be too intelligent either. And so, you know, it's like this impossible narrow line that women are supposed to walk. That, yeah. And so, anyways.
Yeah, we could get into a whole conversation.
Oh, yeah, that's probably something for another show.
So, were you able to read some of the resistance papers when you were doing your research?
Yeah, so there were all sorts of newspapers that were out there. I actually even found a book that was available in Canada for way too much money that had translated a lot of the articles into English so that they could be read. Other than that, I had my Google Translate handy, because you can take the picture and it automatically translates however well that ends up being. It's not always super great, but it's better than nothing. And I speak a little bit of French, but it definitely isn't enough to read these papers. And it really is very interesting. You know, a lot of it did talk about sort of countering the disinformation that the Nazis were trying to give to the French to really demoralize them. A lot of times they would be talking about victories that the resistance had recently had. And the reason for really the reason why they had these newspapers in the first place, the primary goal was to get more people for the French resistance. So you would think that these newspapers were being printed just to give the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, not to be cliche with that. But the reason actually was to enlist more people with the resistance. So they did not always share all of the information. There were some things that they held back as well because they were afraid that it would discourage people from joining the resistance. So, you know, they weren't talking about resistance members that were being captured and held at Montluc prison and being tortured by the Gestapo headquarters. They didn't mention that kind of thing. It was a lot of the atrocities that the Nazis were committing. A lot of times it was very focal, like there was a huge focal point on bread and the lack thereof, and women that were not able to feed their children because they didn't have enough bread. So it would be sort of inciting you know, mobs against the Nazis with mothers who are trying to get bread for their children. Or it could even be, you know, on July 14th on the French Independence Day, encouraging everybody to meet at a certain place and wear red, white, and blue, the tricolors, which really were frowned on being worn during Nazi occupation because it really just elicited this sense of patriotism, and they wanted to do everything that they could to quash that.
I have to just make a side comment here about the whole bread and the mothers, because that is literally what was in all the propagandist papers from the French Revolution, because they really were, and the moms would they're like storming the palace. Like,
you don't mess with babies. You don't mess with our babies.
Children. Where's our bread? Feed our children. So it's just sad that that was happening again.
Hundreds of years later.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Well, I guess like 200 years later, right?
Yeah. So, Lisbon is a really fascinating country during World War II, considering they were one of the neutral countries. And honestly, it's not one that, or Portugal, I should say, Lisbon's a city, but in any case, it's not really one that we often hear about. You know, you hear about Switzerland and things like that, but not Portugal. And from reading your book and listening to you talk about research for, you know, the past year and a half or however long it's been, I learned that it's sort of like a melting pot of a lot of people from a lot of different places and political parties, and that it could have been something like place for a really prosperous person, just as it was a place for someone who was running away from oppression. Can you talk about who was there, why they were there, and the differences in how they were treated within the country itself?
Yeah, so you know, I really, for me, it was interesting learning about Lisbon and Portugal in general, because I genuinely didn't know a lot about it going into this book, which makes, for somebody who loves research, it really makes for an enjoyable task ahead of me, because I had so much to learn. And you know, so not only did you have all of the spies that were coming in because it was a neutral country, which really, if you think about it, it's so crazy, because you would have Nazis sitting at one table, Americans sitting at another table. You could have SOE spies, SOE spies, my brain caught for a second there, sitting at another table. I mean, you really had, they were just all around one another because of the fact that it was neutral. And one quick note on the neutrality. So Portugal produced something that was called tungsten, and tungsten is a material that's used for creating weaponry, like artillery shells, things like that. And so it was very, very important for obviously Germany to have, as well as other countries with the Allies. So really the Prime Minister of Portugal was able to utilize that as a way of really keeping his neutrality, keeping the country neutral, which wasn't always easy. It was always a very, very careful game, if you could imagine. So
I
in
cannot
addition,
imagine sitting beside a Nazi. Like,
oh no, and you couldn't do anything about it.
Yeah,
Like you
that's
couldn't.
so.
Yeah, but you were definitely careful what you were saying. That's for sure. You didn't share any. Although a lot of times they would spreading disinformation was huge among spies. So you would be like, "Oh, I didn't mean to say that," but really you did. Yeah.
On purpose.
Yeah, exactly. Like, so really quick story. I remember one time my youngest, or my oldest one time came home from school, and she was so upset because somebody had told the person that she liked them. And I said, "Oh, that wasn't very nice of her to say that. You know, maybe you shouldn't have mentioned it to her." And she was like, "Or shouldn't I have?" And she did it on purpose because she wanted the person to find out. Anyway, she'd be a good spy. I would not. But so going back to the people who were in Portugal and why they were there, it wasn't just the spies. With it being a neutral country, you also had refugees who were trying to escape the Nazi occupation. So they were pouring into Portugal. And these were Jews who were trying to escape the roundups, who were trying to escape Nazi persecution. And unfortunately, later on, you know, being taken to the camps and everything as well. Sometimes these people were wealthy and they were able to come over with a considerable amount of wealth, and they were staying in places like Estoril in Portugal, which are like these beautiful beachside locations, kind of unfortunately just like running through their money until they could leave. But then you also had people who really just escaped with the clothes on their back, and they had nothing more. And so you go to this country where you don't speak the language, with a lot of other people whose languages you may not speak, and you are just biding your time. In order to get out of Portugal, you had to have several different visas. You needed transit visas, you needed exit visas, you needed all other kinds of visas that were incorporated to kind of trip them up. And once you had those, you needed to get a boat ticket. You could get a plane ticket, but you had to like be incredibly, incredibly wealthy for that. And these boat tickets were few and far between, and you also had to do so within your allotted visa time. And unfortunately, if even just one visa expired, you had to start the whole process over again. It was a very, very maddening experience for these people. And, you know, a lot of countries also kind of reached their capacity of accepting refugees into their countries. But rather than turning around and saying, "No, we're not going to accept any more refugees," they made the red tape so thick that it was almost impossible to get through. So you would have, like, I know for America, you had to have like character witness, you had to have proof that you could afford financially to stay there. You know, all of these things that for these people who didn't know anybody in America and who were there with their clothes on their back, they had nothing. But I will say, you know, it was very interesting. Salazar, who was sort of in charge of, who's dictator really, of Portugal at that time, he was very interesting how he balanced things. So with refugees who were coming in, they could not obtain employment in Portugal. And the reason he did that is because it didn't take jobs from the Portuguese. So it wasn't really taxing their economy. And if they did, if refugees were allowed to open any businesses, for example, it had to be a business that wasn't within that residential area. So if it was a clockmaker, for example, and there were no clockmakers in the area, he could open his shop because it filled a need essentially. But the great thing about that is they're really, and everything that I read about Portugal, anti-Semitism really was virtually absent, which is incredible when the rest of the world was incredibly anti-Semitic. Unfortunately, I mean, even in America. And so you have these people who they welcomed the refugees in. I mean, like Portuguese is not an incredibly wealthy country and the people are not wealthy, but they would share the food that they had. I mean, I remember reading one account where somebody was walking to work and they saw a refugee and he stopped and gave him his lunch. And that meant that he went that whole day working without any food because he thought that person needed it. And that's just incredibly, like, that's how the Portuguese people were during World War II. And like that kind of generosity and love, I mean, that's one of the things that I think is so wonderful about, you know, World War II is such an incredibly dark period in our history, but it's those beautiful moments of light and selflessness that really, I think, is what creates such an appeal within the genre.
Yeah, and you do a really good job of putting those into your books too, to sort of bring that light and hope out to the forefront, I think.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So speaking of neutral country and food, in Portugal, they didn't have rations like they were having around the rest of Europe at the time, which was making it really hard, for example, people in France to get food, besides the fact that the Nazis were taking all the food. So in any case, in your book, you really introduced sort of the theme of feast versus famine. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. And then also, I don't know why, and maybe you do, I'm hoping you do, why they didn't have rations, because it seems like with the rest of the world sort of rationing their food, how come they didn't have to?
To be honest with you, I don't know why they didn't have rations. I will say that in full disclosure, there was a very, very small blip of time that there was a slight ration introduced, but it was such a very slight amount of time that I couldn't find any information on it. And I was very, very diligent with my research. I purchased a sort of a translation program that's sort of like a souped up Google translator. And so in order to try to find additional information that I couldn't, because there's only, I mean, and even to find more books that I could research as well, I would put the American translation or the English translation into the search engine or into that engine. So it would translate it into Portuguese. And then I would put it into a search engine and get my Portuguese results back. And then I would put the results into the translator and get it in English. So, you know, where there's a will, there's a way. But unfortunately, I really never found any concrete information about the rationing. And I even reached out to several people who were living in Portugal who I'd met while I was there. And they said, oh yeah, I remember there was something about that, but I have no idea anything about it. So, I mean, people really, it was such a small thing that I couldn't, yeah. So
I feel
just
like I would remember if it was a thing, because like, you know, in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, whatever, and France and even the United States, they still talk about the rationing. So I feel like they would remember if it was a thing.
Yeah, so I'm not sure why they did not have rationing, but yeah, I mean well, and I will say in visiting, because I did get to go to Lisbon, Portugal, and Lyon, France, and DC, of course, the Library of Congress, for research while I was writing this book. And I have to say, being a foodie, I totally fell in love with all of the food in Lisbon. And so I may have had a wonderful time completely sharing my culinary experience in the pages of the Librarian Spy from our visit from Lisbon. And one particular thing that you'll see mentioned a lot, the pastéis de nata. And it's these little custard cups. And custard is really huge in Portugal. History nerd moment for you. Back in the day, like I think like the 1500s, the monks and the nuns used to use a lot of the egg whites for starching their clothes. So they had all these egg yolks left over. what should one do with all of those egg yolks but make a lot of custard? And so that's sort of where, so if you have anything that has like a filling or a middle or something like that, a lot of times in Portugal, you'll find that it's custard because it sort of falls back on those old,
Yeah.
that old history. But so anyways, pasties de nata, these little cups, pastry cups, and they have the custard inside. And they're super, super good. I'm going to be putting a reader's guide out. It's not out yet. It's almost done. But that actually will have a recipe for pasties de nata. And I say it's foolproof because I tried making it like 4 times and I finally got it right. One time was in your kitchen.
Yes.
Did you ever clean
That
up
was
your
fun.
oven? I'm so sorry.
They were so ugly when they were done, but it was fun making them.
And it dripped all inside of your oven. Oh gosh, I felt so horrible. And I think, did it ruin your pan? I think your pan was ruined after it too.
I don't think it was, I think it just needed a good scrub.
Okay. It was definitely a horribly failed experiment.
It was,
But
they were good though. They tasted delicious.
they tasted good. They looked horrendous. So I did finally nail down the right recipe. So when you read my reader's guide, if you're like, can I make this? If I can make it, you can make it.
And if you mess up, it still tastes good. Eat it.
Yes, exactly. And maybe put some foil at the bottom of your oven just in case.
It did make like a big, like almost like a molten like animal thing was like.
Yes, it was like crawling out.
Yeah.
And it was like, you're delicious, I'm gonna bite you. But yeah, so it was really interesting, really just kind of getting to explore a lot of like the culinary aspects of Portugal, but then, especially the juxtaposition of France and how, with reading so many firsthand accounts, like I said, the overwhelming theme of everything that I read was just this incredible hunger.
Yeah.
People just were always so, so, so hungry. And like their food staples really did end up falling back on Jerusalem artichokes and rutabagas, which previously before the war had been really considered like livestock food. And that ultimately became their survival food during the war.
I gotta say, I do love rutabaga. Like, it's really good.
To be honest with you, I haven't tried it, but then after reading about it so much in the book, I'm like, I don't know if I want to try rutabaga.
Yeah, I'm sad to hear that it's like a livestock option.
Yeah.
I like it roasted with like sweet potato too. Like it's like a savory type thing. And then also if you roast it and then you can like mash it like mashed potatoes, it's so good. But anyways, I digress because you mentioned travel, which was my next question. You were able to travel to all the places that your book takes place. So tell us about your adventures.
Oh man, it was so amazing. So first of all, I just have to say I am so incredibly grateful to have had the opportunity to get to travel because I wrote this last year. So we were still very much dealing with the pandemic and everything, and travel was incredibly difficult. And I did have 7 PCR tests in the course of 2 months. I did not enjoy that aspect of it. But so it was interesting. Initially, the idea was to go to Lyon and to Lisbon at the same time because it was obviously significantly more cost effective. Unfortunately, when France opened up, Portugal was still closed. But it ended up working out well because I went to France. And one of the really amazing things about getting to go to Lyon is they have these things that are called traboules. And as far as I'm aware, they're really only specific to Lyon. And there are these covered passageways that go through buildings. The buildings are all really connected. And you could enter into one entry. Well, sorry. You can enter through one door. There we go. And you could exit on another street, sometimes 3 or 4 blocks away. And it's really incredible. These dated back to the 1800s where the silk workers would, because with Lyon, it has these very steep hills, and silk workers would have to take their product back and forth. And those hills were very cumbersome. So that's where the traboules actually came into play. But they were incredibly helpful during World War II because they could use them to hide from Nazis or to escape. They used it for clandestine meetings. And you also had your letter boxes for all the residents that were there as well. Including one little blank one. Every single building has a blank letterbox, and it used to be referred to as the lovers letterbox, but a lot of times they would use that for the clandestine messages to one another. So that was Lyon, and then I came back and I actually wrote Elaine's story after having gone to France, and then because I actually wrote them independently of one another, and so then I came, and then I got to go to Lisbon, Portugal, and ironically, when Portugal opened, France closed, and I was so incredibly glad that I didn't hold out to go to both countries for when Portugal opened. So in going to Portugal, I mean, I had never been to Portugal before, and it was just so incredibly beautiful. Obviously, I have an affinity for the food. We've already discussed that. But other aspects of the country that I had no idea that existed. They have this thing called calcaita, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's basically these little chunks of limestone and basalt that are almost mosaics that cover all of the walkways. And they're just exquisite. I mean, they're so beautiful. It's like walking on art everywhere you go. And there are different patterns throughout the city. And you know, the interesting thing about the experience of getting to go there and travel there is you see it in pictures and you're like, oh, that's so pretty. And then you walk on it and you're like, this is so slippery.
Oh no.
And so that's something that really you don't know unless you actually went. And a lot of times these are so old that they've sort of settled into like little waves. And as you're walking, it's a little treacherous sometimes, but it really is very beautiful. And then you have all of these different little pockets of Lisbon that are so unique. So there was this huge earthquake in 1755 that was so profound that Voltaire actually wrote about it. He wrote a poem and he also incorporated it into his book Candide. But this earthquake really destroyed most of Lisbon, and it's right on the Tagus River, which unfortunately caused a tsunami. So, and then it also happened to occur on All Saints Day, which meant that everybody had their candles lit. So if it wasn't crumbled, it was washed away. If it wasn't crumbled or washed away, it burned. And it was incredibly devastating. At the time in history, they estimated hundreds of thousands of lives were lost. Now historians don't estimate that it was quite so high of a number, but it was still incredibly significant. And so, you know, one particular town managed to survive called Alfama. And it's such a beautiful little town. And they have these little alleyways, and it's a confusing maze. And it's intentionally that way because there's a castle at the top. And they didn't want people like invaders to be able to come in and march right up to the castle. And I can attest to how hard it is to find, because we even put it in GPS, and GPS was like, I don't know, man, you're on your own on this one. And we had to actually stop and get directions. And you know, it's interesting too, because the some of the places are so close. There was one alleyway that was literally like this big. I mean, I don't even think you can fit your head through. I don't know who's supposed to go through there, like children. I don't know. But and then, you know, they had this music called fado. Oh gosh, getting to go and see fado. It's specific to Lisbon, actually. That was where it originated. And they think it was like around the middle of the 1800s, but that's when people really started talking about. They think it actually probably really did originate after the earthquake with all the sorrow, because it is a very mournful sort of music. And it's just beautiful listening to it. I mean, I was just completely moved to tears, honestly, listening to it. So if anybody has a chance and you want to listen to, you know, really get in the mood of the book and everything, you can put on some fado. I'm sure that Pandora can help you out with that. So, but it was really just, you know, I say, like, whenever I do my research, I feel like it's really laying out like the black and white image of what I want to write, and getting to go there and really have those experiences. It's like coloring it all in.
Yeah, I can imagine that, especially because some of the things that you learned, it's not, you know, you might have seen it if someone wrote about it online or something, but they're more like individualized things, like, you know, how slippery the road is or something like that. It's not like in a review, it might say something like that.
Exactly.
I have two questions that are really kind of combined, so I'm going to combine them for you. And they are about your research, obviously. And it is, what's something that really surprised you during your research? And is there something that you wanted to add to your book that you weren't able to?
You know, gosh, I think what I was the most surprised about really was just like with Lisbon. I mean, I really, like I said, I knew so little about Portugal that it really was all so surprising to me. There was this place in Portugal called Sintra, and it's like this place of they call it the playground of the rich or something like that, because it's all these palaces and manors and everything. And there's one particular palace that I went to called Montserrat Palace. And that actually inspired Byron's Childe Harold's poem, if anybody's read it, because back when he went and visited it, it was so overgrown and everything, which I thought that was amazing, kind of walking the same footsteps that Byron at some point had.
Right.
But you know, so the owner of Montserrat Palace was very much in line with the Allies, and he tried to have a dinner party, or I'm sorry, he tried to actually host a fundraiser to purchase an airplane for the Allies to use, and it was completely shut down by Salazar because he said, nope, we cannot do that. We are a neutral country. So you'll see he really did work very, very hard to make sure that he kept that balance of neutrality in place.
Yeah.
So, you know, I thought that was, but they still did sneak like little dinner parties and stuff. And I did take advantage of that in the book. But, you know, I really think that was just such a hugely surprising thing for me with Portugal, and how perfectly I really do think that he did balance things. But also just even realizing the sort of interminable wait that really did face a lot of the refugees, because you think, oh, well, like if you're just an outsider looking in and you don't know all the details, you think, oh, well, the refugees made it to Portugal. They're lucky. Like that's so safe. But, you know, for them, the safety, it was very much the illusion of safety, because for them, they didn't know if the Nazis would one day decide to attack Portugal and then they're in the same place that they were in before. But then also, you know, if your visa's expired and you didn't have a way to get additional time, you could be arrested by the PVDE. And the PVDE, as kind and loving and generous as the Portuguese people were, cruel, malicious, and vicious were the PVDE. I mean, you know, it really, people were very, very afraid of them. And they had to check in with them once a month while they were refugees in Portugal. So, you know, the safety, it was like a very insecure safety for sure.
Right.
Yeah. Did that answer your question, or did I just ramble off?
No, I think it answers both questions.
Girl, just reel me back if not.
No, you're giving so much great information, and I think it will really help readers sort of understand the research behind the book, and also gain interest in grabbing that book right away when we finish up here tonight.
Thank you.
So another question for you, a theme question, is that in the Librarian Spy, you really use the theme that words have power throughout in different ways. And I'm always super curious about why an author chooses a certain theme. So I want to know why.
Okay, so, you know, the reason for me why words have power is because we're dealing with somebody who's operating this underground printing press. And when you have, you know, with the Nazis, if they had weapons on them, they would have been executed. So they really have nothing to fight with but words. And all I could think of when I was writing this book is the pen is mightier than the sword. And I really sort of went with that concept of they're able to fight as well as they possibly can against these oppressors with the only thing that they have, and that is words. And so you want to make sure that they are as sharp and as cutting as possible. And then, you know, from Ava's perspective, with her being a librarian, clearly words have so much of an impact on her. And so I really did explore more of the book lover side with Ava's character, which is always a fun thing to do as an author, because we all obviously love books. And so for her, you know, she was, you know, she's had a difficult life as well. And even just sort of what she's facing in the future, a lot of times she falls back on her experience through books and what that has meant to her, and the poignancy of different aspects of her life that it's been there to help her through. And you know, as a reader myself, I've had many of those moments. I know that you have too, and probably everybody who's watching this has as well. And so for me, that was a really big part of of Ava's perspective. And so, you know, really the two of the women combined, I really did feel like the power of the written word really was a perfect theme to go through or go for with this book.
Well, it definitely was, and your book is very powerful in your own words. So did a great job. Now, obviously your book just came out this week, so we can't all be gluttonous readers and demand something else right away, but they still want to know what's next.
So I actually just got back from Poland a few weeks ago, where I was doing research for my next book, which is called The Keeper of Hidden Books. I don't have a release date for it yet, but it has a little placeholder on Goodreads. So here's my little shameless plug. It doesn't have a cover. It doesn't have a blurb, but I am keeping little notes and just a blank review. It doesn't have any stars. It's just a little blank review. And I'm making little notes about what's going on with it. So if anybody did want to put it into their want to read, anytime I make any updates on that review section, then you can see what's going on with it.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you for asking.
Yes.
Hello. That was
Welcome.
fantastic. Thank you.
Thank
I did want to, we're coming to the end of our time, but we do have some questions. So I wanted to convey them. There are a lot of great comments too. So if you two want to go back in and look at those.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Afterward. Okay. Gina asked, what is your favorite World War II research book?
Oh, which child is my favorite? I don't know. It's so hard because I mean, my gosh, like dozens and dozens and dozens of books really get read. And that's a hard, traveling is my favorite. I'm taking the total shortcut, easy way out of that one.
Your descriptions of Lisbon, I totally want to go now. I want to go to,
Right?
I want to go to the book fair. Oh,
I want to go see Fado.
Yes.
yes.
Oh, I would go with you. Let's do a Fado trip tomorrow.
When you finish your reader's guide, Madeline, maybe you should do a playlist with it with some suggested.
A wonderful idea. Yeah, thank you for that. Let me actually sticky note
Write that down.
I can add that.
Gina had another good question. It's might be a lot to talk about, but how did you organize all the research when plotting your book?
Oh, so I'm super old school. I write everything in a little spiral notebook as I'm doing my research, and I write it all because if I just read it, it's like it slides right out of my brain with all the other, crazy stuff. But if it goes from brain to hand, I can remember it so much better. And so that really just kind of helped me organize it, and it stays locked in this little compartment.
Let's see. For both of you, what books and authors have inspired you through the years?
Well, I will let Eliza answer that one first. And not to put you on the spot, I was just saying, because I'm the one that's been talking the whole time, so I want to make sure.
We'll give you a little break. You could take a sip of water. So I've always been a huge reader. I read a lot of the classics when I was growing up, but the first historical fiction that I ever read was actually Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. I read that when I was 14 the first time, and I just fell in love with the genre, just the grittiness of it, plus totally like nerding out on the history there. It was fascinating, and he did such a good job of creating sort of strife versus happiness in characters, and then the way they interact with each other. And the interesting thing is, I recommend this book to everyone, and I read it literally every decade because it changes every time I read it, depending on my own personal life experiences. I'll resonate with something different in the book. So I think for me, that was probably the most poignant historical fiction novel that I've ever read, and probably changed my life, I guess. As for books that are coming out now, I soak up everything. I read a lot of stuff for friends, and I can't even mention like a favorite or anything because there's too many good books out there.
There really are. I think what really got me sort of interested in historical fiction and falling in love with reading historical details and things like that is Laura Ingalls Wilder and her Little House in the Big Woods series. So, and the funny thing is, like, I desperately wanted to be Mary, like the good one. And I was just hopelessly Laura. I was always getting into trouble and doing things that I shouldn't. And so I really, really related to her. And I loved all of the historical details. And that was one that I read that series so many times that the books were falling apart, on the spines. And it was just, and I actually never watched the show, but I definitely loved those books.
I've never seen the show either.
Yeah, I felt like the books were enough. I didn't need anything more.
Yeah, I love those books
too.
Oh, I wanted to ask Eliza, you're also working on a new book, if you want.
Oh yes, I'm working on a couple. So I'm doing copy edits actually this week. I should finish hopefully tomorrow, fingers crossed, on a novel coming out next year about Adele Astaire, who is the sister of Fred Astaire, and it's her basically her rise to fame as a dancer, and then she quits dance to follow her heart, but along with some happiness, experiences quite a lot of heartbreak, and then during World War II ended up doing a lot of service overseas, and so it's a good study of her life, but juxtaposed against another woman who sort of grew up in the slums of London, wanting to be a dancer. And her story is kind of opposite of Adele. So whenever Adele is up, she's down. And whenever Adele's down, she's up. And they form a friendship. And I'm saying this all very badly, but I'm very excited about it. And sorry, that was my dog barking. She hates when my door is shut. And anyways, it comes out next year. And I'm not sure of the title yet. It's gone through a series of title changes. Right now, it's called Starring Adele Astaire. So we'll see if that sticks. And then I have a couple other ones that are in the works, but that's the one that I'm currently actively working on.
And I have to say that I've already read it and it's amazing. So once it is available for pre-order and once it does have anything clickable, make sure you get it. Because
I
it is
will.
so good. I loved it.
Thank you so much.
You did such a good job and your research was just so on point. I really loved it.
I had so much fun researching that book.
I can tell it was so good.
Thanks for taking a break from your copy editing to do this event for us to celebrate
I needed
Madeline's
it.
book birthday.
My eyes were crossing. Like I'm really bad about wearing my glasses because on a normal basis I don't need to, like my eyes don't hurt, but every time I do copy edits, I have to break out the glasses because my eyeballs like are literally sore.
Yeah. Yep.
It's hard work.
Not anymore.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I love that it spanned so many different things, especially food. And I also wanted to mention, I live with a librarian, and I think you did an excellent job portraying librarians, with great versatility, truth. Also wanted to ask both of you as we're closing this out and saying goodbye to everyone out there, but are you on social media, and how can people best follow both of you?
Yes, I'm on everything on social media. I'm MadelineMartin.com. If you find me on Twitter or Instagram, I'm Madeline M. Martin because somebody else got to it first.
Yeah, I am on all of the social medias as well. Instagram and Facebook, I'm Eliza Knight Fiction, and Twitter, I'm Eliza Knight.
Awesome.
And your website is elizaknight.com, right?
Oh, yes, I do have a website. Yes, elizaknight.com.
It's a beautiful website.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. Again, happy book birthday to Madeline, and everyone out there, please click the links in the comments to buy both of these wonderful authors' books. And thanks for tuning in. We'll say good night and shut down.
Thank you so much for having us at Warwick's today. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for watching.
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks for writing a great book.
Oh, thank you.
Indeed.
Good night.
See you both later, hopefully for your next books.
Yes.
Maybe in person. That would be wild.
That'd be awesome.
That would be awesome.
Good night, all.
Good night. Thank you.